what types of risks do we know? That seems to be like a brainstorming slide. I quickly go through all of them. We will not have the time to look exactly into each of them. And now bear with me, my assignment, my mapping is on the wrong side. Monitor 2, that should be working now. And then, okay, if we look at the physical part of thing, we have theft of the device, so of the PBX itself. That is a risk. Unauthorized access, when someone is in the room where the device is located. Hopefully it is in a server room that is locked and only authorized people have access. But again, that's not always the case. It has to be the focus on that. It's always the case that the device can only be accessed, or the area can only be accessed by authorized people. Then risk is that we also have in case of security or damaging is fire, water, whatever kind of building damage that can be done. And then, of course, one point that I did not add, because, yeah, in a way, it's not really damage, but we can have, for example, also someone pulls the plug, yeah, PTP, someone pulls the plug. So label the everything that is around with the phone system, or also with the SFBs, for example, on-site. If you have an on-site SFB and a hosted 3CX or a phone system, again, most of these topics that we look at here on a general basis, the general PBX issues, so risks, not only coming down to a 3.6, but of course we focus on it from a 3.6 perspective. We have network security, ensure that the firewall is secure in terms of updates, in terms of passwords, in terms of ports. With phone systems, we have to forward ports. We definitely will look into that as well in a way. And then who has access to the network? Indirect remote attacks, we have man in the middle, and then phishing of passwords or all these kind of things. Indirect means the attack literally goes between the device that sits between the desk and the chair, and it's still the device that is causing most of the risk. So from that perspective, that to train up that device in terms of security and what to do and what to click on and what to not to do, that is definitely one of the high priorities that we all have to face in nowadays IT world. And it doesn't get easier with the use of AI. It's actually even getting worse. So it's training up that device can take a lot of risks away from us. Maybe make here. Yeah. So that is that device. I guess everyone knows that device, has seen one of these devices once already before in his life. They usually, again, they sit between the desk and the chair. That's their location. And they sometimes can uncontrollably click on things or do whatever kind of stuff that can cause harm. It's actually quite often. So that is definitely one of the main focuses when it comes down to securing a system. Teaching them on what to do and not to do. Then we have direct remote attacks, we have brute force attacks, we have distributed denial of service attacks, invite flaws, we have listen to VoIP calls, we have RTP injection and RTP flaws. We have operating system issues, which can be in regards of updates when the update of an operating system has not been done for a long time period and there is a security issue, a breach on that version, then it can be possible that someone can come through that uh, system onto the phone system, can gain access, and then also, for example, via passwords, if we use passwords that are easily to be recognized from that perspective, there is always a risk in that regard. Provider issues also, of course, downtime of the VoIP provider and also downtime of the internet provider. From that perspective, if necessary, a plan B would have to be implemented in terms of B for backup internet, backup VoIP provider where the calls can get routed out if the first path, plan A, is actually down. Again, that comes down to the situation on if it is required to have such a high uptime. That can also link again back to physical. The building, of course, can also have power outage. Then people would have to look into power supply unit. Of course, the question there would be, or the point there would be, have not only the PBX running with a power supply, but also the internet connection. If the PBX is on site, and of course then also in a way, if necessary, have a switch or two or three behind the power supply unit that actually feeds the physical phones. Yeah. If the PBX is hosted in a outage, for example, if there's power outage in the area where the branch is, then if people have, for example, the mobile client, in case of 3CX now, the mobile client on the mobile phones and the 3.6 is hosted, then yeah, use the mobile client. There's no big deal because you can connect via the Wi-Fi, the 4G or the 5G from the mobile provider, and then you generally can reach the hosted system. So a lot of that stuff goes actually into physical, mainly goes into system on premise. Of course, there is also the other way around if the hoster has an issue. Yeah, but there is not much that you really can do in that regard. You could have the system with a failover on spinning up on another hoster, and then you would actually be able to use it. But again, comes down how long that downtime is on the hoster. Provider issues, again, coming down to their hacks if the VoIP provider or the hoster are hacked. System failover, just mentioned that before by the physical issue, failover in place, for example, to kick in when the hosted device has an issue, the hoster has an issue, so that the failover will take over. Here, then again, comes down to having as fast as possible the FQDN activated with the new public IP address so that the phones literally can connect to there. That comes down then again to which DNS servers do I use? Are they updating fast enough? Again, as I mentioned in the last week in the advanced training, it often comes down to that when the customer has a DNS, a local DNS, that this local DNS that they have in the building, we saw that they often just update the DNS entries every 12, 24 hours, that kind of stuff. So which means that the phones or any device who actually is then trying to reach the FQDN is not getting an updated um, IP address in case of a failover. So that has to be implemented, that these devices then more or less are able to reach to the new IP that is bound to the FQDN. Backups, again, we had that also last week. Make sure you have backups, make sure you have backups in place, that they are available, make sure they are somewhere accessible, make sure they are as latest version as possible, and if encrypted, make sure you have the right password ready. So this is just literally an overview what kind of risks in regards of a running phone system, of keeping it up and running, we know. Today, we look at the security on the extension level, user level, departments, outbound rules, event log, IP blacklist, anti-hacking, console restriction, allowed country codes, secure zip parameters, custom templates, system updates, system options, and then we also look into the 3.6 ecosystem. We look into how to secure the firewall, and we look into the 3.6 on a local network. We look at the operating system, and then we also look at general security thoughts. If you look at all those topics, you look at the time we have, then you can imagine that it might be that your brain is going to smoke a little bit at the end of the session. Now, if we look in the security overview on the extension level, that is generally on the extension. So that's everyone has access to that. That's on everybody's general extension under the settings in call forwarding schedule section. We can disable outbound calls outside the office hours. If this is using a office hours enabled, yeah. So if we have office hours on the system, if we have them set on the system, then we can say that we can disable outbound calls outside of office hours. That makes sense in terms of if we have cleaners coming in after the work, when people did leave the desk, that these people are not able to establish calls that would go via the trunk. Okay. Then in the admin section, you see up here, we have that on the extension level. In the admin section, that is only accessible if you have rights for the admin section. In the user level, on the general, we can enable the 2FA, so the two-factor authentication, which makes sense in terms of access to the web client security. So if someone wants to access the web client, then he has to enable, or if 2FA is enabled, he cannot just jump in there. So that is a higher form of security. Then also set the role only to what the extension is meant to be. Do not give higher privileges than actually required from a whatever kind of security perspective in terms of do changes on the back end of the system or what else ever. I'm just thinking about in terms of if the user has a access only as on a general user level, there cannot be access to the admin level. And then if people would require admin access, create them a separate login where they have to log in with separate credentials. Maybe that then also 2FA enabled, and they do the changes there and then they log out to actually once they have done those changes. This gives a little bit more security in terms of configurations, especially if people do not shut down their computers overnight. And then in the end, the computer is unattended and someone is sneaking in from the behind because the device between keyboard and chair clicked on a risky link during the day. Yeah, so it's just I've seen that stuff plenty of times. So from that perspective, there are ways, thoughts how you can work around that stuff. In the admin, we are still in the admin section. We most likely move within the admin section now over the next couple of slides. In the admin section, under the user's voicemail, enable voicemail only if required. So if that extension does not require voicemail, disable it. If the extension is, for example, a dummy extension that is required to do whatever kind of call operations, disable it. By default, voicemail gets enabled, so specifically disable it. In case of higher security, use use more digits on the pin instead of just the 6. There used to be 4. You remember with version 16.18, we used to have 4 digits. Now it's 6, but you can increase up to 9 digits. Also, in that regard, if possible, keep that disabled here. So do not tick disable voicemail pin so that it's really more secure. I know people don't like to remember those numbers, but it's still, we come then further down to a section where you can see that it can be in a way abused. People who attended advanced trainings prior, they generally know what is going to come then there in that regard. Now, under the options, we have further options in regards of we can disable the extension if the extension is not used anymore. So, for example, the user that used that extension has left the company, but the company, the customer wants to keep the extension up so that it can be reassigned to someone who is coming in a couple of months. Disable the extension. Enable pin protect can also be done so that literally the system or the phones, desk phones in that regard, are protected via PIN, that someone has to enter a PIN to actually use them. Then under the options, block remote non-tunnel connection. So that will be literally in terms of stun phones, for example, to have no stun phones in use. Just use SBC phones or just the applications like the web client, the progressive web app, the mobile client, or the Windows soft client. And then also we can use SRTP, so encrypted audio. This requires secure SIP. Now, here as well, disable external calls overall. This, for example, can make sense when it is a phone that hangs somewhere on a wall in a public area that someone is not able to um, literally dial out and just dial internally, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So just always keep those configurations, those security options in mind. Now, if we go then ahead under the user level in the admin section, we go to view and then we go to departments. We can then there define who can see what and who can do what. Yeah, so that is then, we see here, it is the user extension. We could enable here that he or the others can see his calls, others can see the presence, he can see calls, and he can do operations. So that can be generally changed in different ways. And I quickly apologize, I wasn't thinking again to the people who actually have issues with the thing. And that actually, this one here, the the red block, I will try to avoid that as well in the future. I had done that presentation already prior that I was actually made aware of that. Of course, we have people who have issues with recognizing different colors that will have a different color in the future as well. So apologies for that. So yeah, we can here in a certain way keep the privacy of people intact. Of course, if we would have here multiple different departments, we then also would have to define in those other departments what is actually can be seen from that person. Yeah. So that all would have to be added in there. Then in the departments, what is usually set, or what I usually do or advise, is that I create departments that in that regard then are used for call routing. So in that regard here, you see you have an international, a local, and a national department. These departments, if we go back, could be, for example, those ones here, and they would be blank because nobody needs to see the phones that are in these departments and have to do operations there, because the phone actually is just, or the department is just used for giving the source allowance for the devices or users that are inside those departments. Yeah. So you see here, for example, I have the phones are all the same in the end. It's just the um, how they are different, how they are added is different. But for example, you see there are certain devices that are not in that list below. Cyberdata Horn to an IP4s, they are not inside in those international, local, and national departments, because these devices are not meant to make any form of outbound calls. Yeah, so I would just create the department and add then there the allowed users. This makes it easier because I don't have to filter on the per user basis. I filter on the on the department basis. From that perspective, it's easier to maintain in the future as well. Then outbound rules, again, you see here we have local, national, international. We have a prefix from 1 to 9 on local, which means we don't use 03, 07, all that stuff. Therefore, we have a length of 8, and then we also use the department local. Yeah. Now, we often get asked, why should we not use just a single rule with 0 to 9 only? Depending on the system setup, a 0 to 9 can dial anywhere. Different trunks, bridges for different destinations, limitation on allowed users are not given there in that regard. Why should we make it easy for intruders? Of course, there's no 100% security with that either. I have seen systems where they jumped into the system and they adjusted the outbound rules to actually do what they wanted to do, but we make it a little bit harder for them because they actually have to reconfigure then the outbound rules. And if someone is not 100% skilled, already the calls might fail. Yeah. So it's just an additional barrier to add. Why is the allowed country code list not enough? Adding an extra level of security in case of misconfiguration and international calls that are allowed. But the VoIP provider has call restrictions in place as well. Not every provider offers call restriction to international calls. So it is not guaranteed that your provider that you use is actually filtering based on the dialed country, and not every toll fraud suspicious call pattern is recognized by the VoIP provider. Again, it is just there's an add-on in terms of security that we can add there. Yeah. Again, here, the national, we use then the prefix where they are allowed to dial to 02, 03, 07, whatever, and then with the length of 10. And then we have the international with the plus 00, 0011, and then the number length, the digit length from 11 to 20. Again, source filtering based on the department, and inside the department I have then the allowed users. Event log, the event ID can be found online by clicking on the ID. So if we go and click on this ID, then here we will come down to this page, and we will see the event log. Now, if we then go on the notifications, we can set up email notifications in terms of so the system admins by default are getting notified, but then we can also define that the system owners as well are notified by just simply ticking that box, and then also additional email addresses separated with a comma. We can say anti-hacking request requests, calls made to blocked countries, IP has been blacklisted, trunks SBCs are down, for example, which is then in regards of the overall system functionality. Hard disk is near or at capacity, these kind of things. So we can do that. Of course, we have to see if we have, let's say we have 50 systems, and we have on all of these 50 systems, we have all boxes ticked, or as many as possible, or whatever. We are, in a way, we are flooded by emails. from time to time. Yeah. Okay, so use that with care, or set up a email inbound rule, or create a separate email address for every system, which is not really useful, but yeah, try to filter it so that it goes not fully into your email, but of course you should know what's coming up or what's going on, but that you have it, for example, in a subfolder or whatever. However, you actually what works best for you. Yeah. Then here, event log examples. I think there was actually not even an event log entry here. Yeah. So that is now generally nothing else. Yeah, we see here the ID. The ID is here. I don't know why it's there, but when you click on that idea, you actually it doesn't show up any entry in the event log on the event log page. However, this is a typical behavior of a system that is actually under attack. Yeah. Here in that system, we have port 5060 is publicly open. So we literally do our full cone, and literally everyone can come in. And as soon as Sip Vicious is finding open ports on 5060, they give it a go. Yeah. And that can turn out into the situation that it's literally turning out to be a DDoS attack. Yeah. They just hammer you down. You have to see Sid Vicious is literally, that's not a whoever sitting there behind a computer and looks at a specific IP address. That stuff usually comes as well, like the other attacks, via botnets. Yeah, so they usually have that automated, and they just scan the whole internet for IP addresses that are open on 5060. And if they find an IP address that is open on 5060, they go for it. And that does not mean that they actually succeed to establish a call. They actually can even, just with the amount of requests that they do, they actually can bring your internet service, so your internet on the WAN side, and they can overflow it with requests. I had customers who actually were not able to do any more phone calls because just the system got hacked. And then you go onto the phone system. That was a different one. That wasn't 360, this one I'm talking about now, but it's still, the whole event log was red, and all you need to do is literally lock down 5060 to, yeah, we look at that then afterwards. But still, I can't mention that often enough. Yeah, because under normal circumstances, when we set up the system properly, the way it has to be, we only use the VoIP provider on 5060. Everything else goes via either HTTPS or via the tunnel. Yeah. So we have here now you see, it's a call coming in, and then of course, once they come into the system, they try to go then further out. We see it comes here from 5005. Oh, it's actually extension 5005, sorry, on that IP address, comes from that port. Yeah, all these kind of things. And then literally just tries to dial out. We see then in the event log that that IP address has been blacklisted. By default, it gets blacklisted for 86,400 seconds, which is 24 hours. The reason too many failed authentications. In the IP blacklist, that is then the next section. If we go down that list on the in the 3.6, the Explore list on the left side, we then see in the admin section, advanced IP blacklist, we then see that we can add IPs, we can allow or delete IPs. These IPs then we can define for a certain time period, expiration date. What we should do is allow trusted static IPs. For example, if the system is hosted the company IP and the VoIP provider IP, and then block known suspicious IPs. Do not allow dynamic IPs because that doesn't make any sense. Has to be static. You can add single IP addresses. You can add IP ranges. Do not whitelist too big IP ranges. It's just for the security case of thing. And of course, add a description what that IP address actually is. Then the anti-hacking section. Generally, for most cases, these the default values work well. We would not have to go to restrict that further, except you want to increase the blacklist time interval. This can be of a pain when you block yourself out. Can happen in that regard, then you probably would have to log in from a different IP address via the mobile phone or hotspotting quickly the mobile connection to the laptop or wherever. But then again, this is 24 hours. You define how long a blacklisted device or blacklisted IP has to stay blacklisted. Generally, that's 24 hours. You could say, okay, I leave that, and when something has been blacklisted, I jump into the system and then I either release it and put it into the whitelist if it was something that is actually white, or I take the IP address and then I blacklist it for the next 40, 50 years. Yeah. We have live chat request protection, where we can say the maximum allowed requests per IP is 20 requests. That kind of stuff. Again, I wouldn't go too much playing around with that. Also with the security barrier in terms of the amount of packets that are coming from that IP address. We see here the green is 200. Then we have 2,000 packets, that is amber. So that blocks the IP for 5 seconds, then it opens it again. If it continues to come with that high amount of packets, it will block it again. And then at some point, when it comes with 4,000 and more requests, and I see there is a thing inside there, I have to take that away then afterwards. When that one is happening, that it has 4,000 or more requests, the IP address will be blacklisted for the blacklist time interval, which is again those 24 hours. Failed challenge requests by default are 1,000. Those attacks can send register requests but do not reply to the challenge. Configure the amount of fake requests that 3.6 will accept per IP address before blacklisting the IP. We have to be careful with that one, because if we have a flaky network or the configuration for IP phones is not 100% correct, and sometimes it can happen that also allowed devices are doing a failed challenge. Then if we go further down with this one, we can block our own or our customers' own devices. So we have to be careful with that there as well. Now, console restriction. On the console restriction, we define from which IP address the admin console can be accessed. If we look at the web client, where is my thing? If we look at the web client, let's say I take that quickly in here. That is the web client. Oops. And then up the top up here, I have the dialer and all these things. Then here I have the team and then whatever meetings and all that stuff I have. And then at the very bottom, that's my thing, I have here, I have the cogwheel. Yeah. This restriction restricts the IP addresses that can access the cogwheel, the admin section. Even if I come with a IP that is not allowed, I still can access the web client, but I will not be allowed to access the admin section. Yeah. So from that perspective, add specific IP addresses into here, add them there. Make sure they are static IPs and make sure that they are belonging to people who are allowed to access the admin section. That gives you, that allows you or gives you more control that not everyone can access the admin backend, especially also if, again, if there is the device with between keyboard and chair or between table and chair involved. So if someone sneaks in through the user that has partial access or what else ever to the system, if that person, for example, is at home, no access. If the person is logging in from the office, access, that kind of stuff, for these kind of things. It's just giving a higher form of security to it in terms also of accessing through the web, the open web GUI of the user, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Then allowed country codes, that's also then we see we really work our way down that uh, that list. Allowed country codes, by default, only the country code of the installation country area is allowed. So when I set up a system in Australia, or I define Australia as the location, then only calls to numbers starting with 61 international calls are allowed. However, it could be that we have to open it for CEO or what else ever, for depending on what the company is actually having as a business model, that kind of stuff. So then we would open them, and then in the end, the system would allow calls to country codes internationally or what else ever. Yeah. Again, coming again with the device between table and chair. If someone has access to that backend, for example, through the computer or what else ever, or faked website, can be that someone receives an email and you don't look on which link you click. Yeah, you get an email which says 3CX um, um, password verification, you know. Then you click on it, and then you come to a web GUI that looks very, very similar to the 361 also. I mean, that's absolutely no issue to replicate nowadays. And then you can say enter, reconfirm your password. And then at the top here somewhere is a dodgy domain, and people do not really look on that stuff. And that's then actually really linking again to the device between table and chair. And then you enter your password. Done. Yeah. Extension number. Then maybe extension number, verify password, extension number, password, and they have, yeah, the password. Of course, they still need the FQDN, but then they send it to a domain email, for example. Yeah, um, user, user at domain dot com.au. So it must have received someone. So from that perspective, it's not so hard to get behind these kind of things, yeah? Not so difficult yet, because the domain, even the 36 FQDN usually links to the company name. Yeah. Okay. So once they are in there, they can change that all and then adjust the outbound rules. That one here is definitely easier to adjust than set up proper outbound rules. However, they can do both if they have access to the back end. Yeah. Secure SIP. If we look at secure SIP, do not do anything in that section. Also, do not turn that off. If you turn that off, the whole certificates are gone. Yeah, they're gone. So secure SIP is enabled on the 3CX with the certificate and key provided. Leave enable SIP enabled in order to not lose the cert and the key. Yeah. If you untick that here, the content here is gone and your cert and key is gone as well. Yeah. Secure SIP requires TLS. To use SIP, your provider must support TLS. Okay. Parameters. In the parameters section, you can change values in the system, whatever kind of stuff. Do not try to change anything in that area there, at least not if you're not skilled enough and if you don't know what you're doing. You can break stuff inside there. The same goes with custom templates. Do not go and change the templates if not really necessary. It's just because if you enter or disable something in the template, then it can be that there is a way opened to get onto the system in different ways. System updates, again, something people who know me, they know how I think on system updates. There's always two sides of the coin. With applying updates straight away, you are up to date. Waiting for a moment, you are in the end running behind, but you can ensure that the customer has his system working with the hardware that he has. So if there is something that is not working afterwards anymore when you update it, you are not impacted by it. When you take the update immediately, you don't know if there are any bugs around. We remember last year the issue with the Electron app. That has been avoided by anyone who did not take the updates straight away. Yeah. See here, updates is this kind of love-hate in IT and therefore also in telecommunications. You can't live without them, but you don't also always want to accept changes. Updates need to be applied, but not immediately after release. We remember the system stability CrowdStrike. We remember the security risk 3.6 app issue in, I think it was May 23 or so. Immediate update issue was present, monitoring issue was avoided. Yeah. So it is that kind of stuff which you really have to, do I do it? Do I don't do it? I personally would advise to give it a grace period of at minimum 4 weeks. Monitor the message board, see if there is stuff coming up, if there's stuff coming along, and then if it's a major update, definitely would go even wait for like 2 months, stuff like that. Yeah. Also, so from that perspective, do not enable automatically update 3.6 when you are on 3.6 hosted. So hosted by 3.6, you have no other chance. If you are on-prem or self-hosted, you have that opportunity to decide what you want to do. Also, if we look at the updates here now, I cannot mention that often enough. Do not apply beta versions to a live productive environment unless 3CX directly asks you to do so. This usually in the update section here, there is also a version, a beta version, and it's actually linking in a red text. It's saying your system is out of date, which it is not. A final version can never be out of date to a beta. Yeah. So a lot of people are not fully reading what is written here and literally then update. They see, oh, red, oh, are not up to date. Yeah, update, and they install a beta. I would say probably in most cases it's not causing an issue, but it could. Yeah. So you can do that on the system that you run in your garage, where you want to play with it and all that stuff, where you want to see new features, but do not install beta versions on live systems. Okay. In the system section, in the admin backend on the options, we have this one here. Enable outgoing calls in the voicemail menu. When this one is enabled, we actually allow someone to, let's say, hack into the voicemail from someone. And by that, then literally go out and do an external call. We go here, we go then via a system extension. and not via the user extension. Okay? The voicemail is a system extension, and the voicemail establishes the outgoing call. It's not the user extension. So we have no control in that regard there on what goes out. Okay? So if you have a customer, 300 users, and only one wants to have that feature, try to, even if it's the CEO, try to convince him to not do it, because that is then globally. You can only enable that globally. Yeah. Allow direct SIP calling. Direct SIP calling is literally IP calling, and that's the mischief that we have, for example, on remote stun locations when they are not configured properly. Yeah, I have 20 stun phones. 20 stun phones. They all sit behind the firewall. Firewall port preservation wasn't done. These devices, they connect out via 5060, and they all connect out on different times and all that stuff. 5060 port usually then is always open, and then SIP-vicious comes in. And then why are my phones ringing all the time? Yeah. Yeah. Allow direct SIP calling. Port forwarding not done. 5060 not locked down. You have a ringing concert on the customer's end. Okay? In the soft client, the Windows soft client connects to the 3.6 using tunnel port 5090, which is encrypted and secure. Huh? Allowing the user to access the 3.6 using a dynamic IP. Calls between the client and the 3.6 are encrypted, and I do not have 5060 open for this user on 3CX side and on the user side. Oops, user side, yeah, because we use 5090 encrypted tunnel and we go out through the firewall. The only thing that could cause an issue for this one is if we have on the firewall, for example, on the firewall, on the user side, if we have, for example, proxy enabled, or it could be that um, also causes an issue. Okay, that can be the case. Now, generally, it is a outgoing connection, so the request goes out similar to an SBC, or yeah, the request goes from the device to the 3CX. On the 3.6, it connects the 3.6 on 5090 on the tunnel port. 5090 goes to the 3.6, connects. Yeah, safe. Web client, the web client to connect to the 3.6 using the 3.6's HTTPS port. So we are literally connecting via web socket. From our browser, we create a connection to the web server on 3CX using HTTPS, and then we have literally the session running in the browser. Depending on the port that we use when we set up the 3CX, we have to use either 443, which is the default HTTPS port, 5001, which is originally the default 3CX HTTPS port, or whatever was defined. All that is required when we choose that HTTPS port is that it is not colliding with the ongoing HTTPS traffic in that environment where the system is set up. If we have it hosted, like for example in the cloud on, let's say, Asia, then the 3CX has its own subnet. So there's nothing else that is having an issue when we use 443. Same most likely goes with Google, AWS, Lightsail, and all that stuff. It's just because the systems there, they have their own dedicated subnet behind a firewall, and they don't annoy anyone else when they use 443. If we are on premise, we have lots of devices that use 443. Every browser uses 443, and if we say, okay, do a port forward to 443 on the IP of the 3CX, we would not be able to use the browsers anymore because every request that comes back goes over to the PBX. In that regard, this is why we could use 5001, the default one, or we can set any port that is available. Of course, it's a port that has to be free and also not occupied from the PBX, for example, so from like the RTP port ranges. So yeah. This allowing the user to access the 3.6 using a dynamic IP. Of course, if we want to access the admin backend, we have the admin backend locked down to allow the IPs only, we have to use a static IP. Calls between the client and 3.6 are encrypted. End-user security concerns, phishing mails asking to set up a new password, remote access to admin console through the web client, man in the middle. The mobile client is more or less the mobile equivalent to the Windows soft client. The mobile client connects to the 3.6 using the 3.6's tunnel port, allowing the user to access the 3.6 using a dynamic IP. Calls between the client and the 3.6 are encrypted. There's literally nothing else than what we have with the Windows soft client on the mobile phone. Looks slightly different, slightly different functionality, but it is literally the same. From the connection, it's the same. Session border controller. The SBC connects to the 3.6 using the 3.6 tunnel port, allowing the remote IP phones to access the 3.6 using a dynamic IP. Calls between the IP phones and the 3.6 are encrypted. Calls between devices behind the same SBC stay inside the local LAN. So we have 3.6 here, hosted, of course. We have the SBC here. This traffic here is using the encrypted tunnel 5090. The phones if they dial out via the trunk, SIP and RTP goes that way. If they dial out between each other, SIP goes that way, RTP goes that way. Of course, in case we need to troubleshoot, we have to say PBX delivers audio, and then the audio makes a loop through here and goes back. Yeah, but that's with a SBC, that's just for troubleshooting or call recording, of course. If we have calls recorded, audio always goes via the PBX. Router phone. The SBC phone connects to the 3.6 using the SBC, the 3.6's tunnel port. allowing the remote IP phones to access the 3.6 using a dynamic IP. Depending on the router phone model, up to 10 IP phones can connect using a router phone. Calls between IP phones and the 3.6 are encrypted. Calls between devices behind the same router phone stay inside the local LAN. So it's literally the same like this one, just with limited capacity. Firmware. Using IP phones ensure they are running the latest versions to avoid possible security issues. See here, this one is not on the latest version, should be updated. Only use firmware from official sources. Of course, there can be sometimes very old firmware on a device if it hasn't been updated regularly. However, do not go and dig somewhere on pages, suspicious pages, and download firmwares from there. Yeah, could be that there is something additional, a free gift coming that runs then in a backend or whatever kind of setup. Yeah, just bear that in mind. Securing the firewall, the default zip port, and why to open the firewall. In the world of networking, it is an absolute sin to open any port publicly to the WAN and forward it to the internal network. It is clearly creating a high security risk. I'm absolutely agreeing with that. Now, suddenly, the network engineers are asked by telecommunication engineers to open specific port ranges to the WAN. Why is that? Imagine the following scenario. There is an IP-PBX connected to a VoIP provider via a firewall without NAT on port 5060. What happens is if an incoming call reaches the WAN side of the firewall. So I have a trunk here that goes through the firewall and registers on a VoIP provider. On that trunk, of course, I have a number. Let's say that number is 0312344. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now someone is dialing that number. The trunk is registered. The trunk is registered and has a register timeout for probably like, let's say, 60 minutes, 60 minutes re-register time. When the trunk is registered initially, it opens port 5060 on the firewall. That port is open for, I don't know, let's say 2 minutes or so. That's what happens very often. I add a trunk, I register the trunk. It's registered. I dial in to see if the phone number is working. That happens within like 10 seconds after the registration happened. I dial in, the call comes in, it reaches the PBX. Fine, everything is working. I walk away. Half an hour later, customer calls and says, I can't dial in. When I try the number, it's not connecting. I tested it, it works. It's not working. Then you try again. True. Call is dropping. Yeah, doesn't get anywhere. Why? Because 5060 is not open. It is the job of the firewall to literally deny every connection request if there has not been an outgoing connection. What we usually do in our daily life is we sit on a computer, we open the browser, we go out to the internet through the firewall, and we go to a web server and we ask content from them. There is also a timeout in between here. Yeah. If the web server is not responding within a certain given time, I have a message on my browser, timeout. Yeah. Connection failed, or the server was not responding within a certain period of time. Yeah. So it is always expected that that response comes back as fast as possible. So I go onto that web server, ask for content, the traffic comes back, and the traffic comes back to that port where the firewall defined when the firewall was sending out the traffic or the request to the server. Comes back to that port and then goes back to the originator. It's all handled by the firewall. And the firewall knows which incoming traffic belongs to which outgoing traffic. Now, in that scenario here, all of a sudden, there comes traffic and wants to go to that device here, but there was no request. Yeah, nobody asked outbound words. Of course, half an hour ago, there was a connection built up to a VoIP provider and other, but that session closed. That's closed since. Yeah. And now all of a sudden they want to come in. Sorry, no. Doors are closed. Yeah. Firewall is doing the job. Yeah. Our communication with the internet is usually from the LAN to the WAN. By that, the firewall can associate incoming traffic as a response to outgoing traffic. If we access our company network from remote, we use a VPN. With a PBX, this option is simply impossible. Yeah. Now imagine every PBX would have to offer a VPN to every possible individual that could potentially call in. Yeah. That's just an absolutely impossible scenario. Additionally, in the SIP protocol defines the port used, not the transport header. Therefore, we must open the firewall. 3.6 says full CONAT. I say something else, but we will see that then afterwards. So we open the firewall publicly, and we have to keep port preservation. It is mandatory that the SIP port stays the SIP port. So we generally, it's the SIP server that sends out the request that defines the port. By default, 5060 is the SIP port. We can change that on a SIP server when we install the system. We can say our system, just as an example, uses 5070. We send out the request as the source port 5070. We connect to the VoIP provider. The VoIP provider is always running on 5060, always. So we connect from source port 5070 over to 5060. The VoIP provider sees, okay, 5070 on that IP here, so WAN IP, IP 5070, sends the traffic back to WAN IP 5070. If we have 5070 open, then it has to go to PBX IP 5070. And then it comes over to the PBX. In our example here, we use 5060. So the trunk is registered from 5060 to 5060, comes back 5060 to the PBX. Firewall is open on 5060. After 50 minutes, a call comes in. The provider sends the call to the WAN IP from where the registration was coming from on port 5060. 5060 is open, sends it through to the PBX, and oh wonder, it is ringing. Yeah, no more blocking. Okay, so it's very important. You can play with the ports on the PBX side because the request comes from the SIP server, from the PBX to the provider. We have to be aware that if we use something else than 5060, so use something else than this, for example, 5070, or I know people who used, for example, 15,060 or whatever. First of all, that port has to be free on the network. Second, I create port forwarding for that port properly on the firewall. And the last one is that the VoIP provider is capable of returning traffic back to a port that is anything else than 5060. There are VoIP providers who can only or who will only send SIP traffic back to 5060. Despite of if you come with, for example, WAN IP, let's say 15,060, the VoIP provider will send it back to WAN IP 5060. Yeah, but that comes down to the VoIP provider. Generally, only do that here, that kind of stuff, that kind of stuff, that kind of stuff, if you know what you are doing. If you are not sure, stay with 5060, but then you have to ensure the following. Default SIP port 5060 and SIP vicious part 1. SIP vicious is a set of tools, that can be used to audit SIP-based VoIP systems. To audit means to do something good. This suite has 5 tools: the SV map, the SV war, the SV crack, SV report, and SV crash. The SV map is a SIP scanner. When launched against ranges of IP address space, it will identify any SIP servers which it finds on the way, if it can access the network. SVC crack is a password cracker making use of digest authentication. It is able to crack passwords on both registrar servers and proxy servers. SV war identifies working extension lines on a PBX, also tells you if extension line requires authentication or not. SV report is able to manage session created by the rest of the tools and export to PDF, XML, CSV, and plain text. SV crash responds to SV war and SV crack SIP messages with a message that causes old versions to crash. Okay, now where is the issue? SIP vicious is by default scanning SIP port 5060. If 5060 is publicly open in order to not only accept traffic coming from VoIP providers, but also from remote stun manually configured extensions on the PBX, that's it going about any PBX, not only 3CX. This is a SIP rudimentary issue. Yeah. Every PBX that has 5060 open, or every site that has 5060 open, becomes prone to SIP vicious. After Open 5060 was found, so in first row, the botnet is scanning for open 5060 ports. We have here firewall using full CoNAT, so 5060 is publicly fully open. It's like if you have your house door open, yeah? Not even the lock, the key not turned, but literally you come home and you put your door open, and in the morning you leave the house, you don't close the door, it's just publicly open. Wonder what you find at the end of the day when you come home. Okay. So full CoNAT is in use. Botnet is scanning for open 5060 ports. And as you might know, botnets, they never sleep. Yeah, it's not like we go at some point we have to go to sleep. We can't supervise everything everywhere. So they just scan and crawl through the whole internet and find open 5060 ports. After port 5060 was found, they are going to attack the IP, the PBX. Yeah. Default SIP port and SIP vicious part 2. Now, how can such an attack impact your system? Once an open 5060 firewall has been found, the attack begins. SIP vicious then, amongst other attacks, tries to register as an extension on the PBX, establish call on the PBX, access active calls. The way this is done can come close to be or be called as a distributed denial of service attack, causing the PBX to act as a firewall with unnecessary load on CPU and RAM, unnecessary exposure to traffic from the WAN, failure to act properly, system overload, extended traffic inside the LAN, failure of internet traffic due to the number of requests from the WAN. To avoid these risks, the firewall must be configured correctly. We have the botnet is red and the VoIP provider is green. We add ACL on port 5060, inbound ACL on port 5060, locking down the port 5060 to the IP of the provider. Again, this setup expects that you are using 5090 tunnel. We see that then afterwards. I do it now here, 443 5001 HTTPS. Huh? That's it, generally. Yeah. And 5060 then, 5060 provider locked down IP. Yeah. So, which means everything that comes from the IP from the provider passes through to the PBX. Everything that comes from a IP that is not allowed is blocked and dropped, which means the PBX can do what the PBX has to do, listen for incoming calls, establish outgoing calls, and the firewall is doing what it is actually meant to do, blocking unnecessary or unwanted traffic before entering the network. We can, of course, if we use the proper or the right hardware, of course, we have to. People who attend my basic trainings, they know my general rant at the beginning of the basic session with what kind of hardware to use. Definitely not do-it-yourself hardware where you can't lock down IP addresses to ports. Use business-grade hardware and know how to handle or configure that device. You can have multiple IP providers, VoIP providers that are accessing via 5060, but your device has to be able to allow all their IPs or IP ranges. Yeah, but that's how you set up the trunk and the 5060 port properly, and you protect the system from attacks of ZipFishes and other scanning tools. Securing the firewall, looking at NAT/PAP. This is how such a secure solution would look like. We have the IPPBX sitting on-prem or hosted, doesn't matter. IPPBX again, this can be any PBX. It's a SIP relevant request or question. Of course, we use here 3CX with the matching ports, yeah? Protocol HTTPS, the port that is depending on your setup, what you configure on the system. ACL in place, no. SIP 5060, ACL in place, yes, only. VoIP provider, RTP by 3CX by default, it's 9,000 to 10,999. ACL in place, no. Tunnel, ACL in place, no. We see here we connect using the default SIP port 5060 using the VoIP provider. connecting using the default SIP port 5060, a remote IP phone with a static WAN IP only. This we can lock down. This is working. This we can then also use in stun, but it has to be a static WAN IP only. Then we can lock it down. Connecting using the tunnel, port 5090, router phone, hardware SBC. Connecting using HTTPS, the web client. Connecting using the tunnel port 5090, mobile client, Windows client. That is a setup that you can use. That is a setup that will work, and that is a setup that is safe and secure in that regard. Local networking, access to PBX networking devices. Looking at a corporate network, comms rooms usually should be locked and accessible to authorized personnel only. However, this is often not the case. Switches often are accessible in general areas or in the office, or comms rooms are not locked. One would wonder why this matters. Under normal circumstances, one could say it really doesn't matter, but it still leaves access to unauthorized people to listen to calls using Wireshark. Wireshark is a network traffic analyzer and generally used for troubleshooting, but again, like SipVicious, can be abused. All that is required, a small PC, a USB to RJ45 mirror or small RJ45 hub, Wireshark. With this setup, all calls using local IP phones coming over that connection can be recorded, and for all calls, connection information can be accessed depending on the setup. Phone, 3CX app, more or less, yeah? So if the connection here is not encrypted, I can have a mirrored connection to a computer that runs Wireshark, and the whole audio can be collected there. So again, in that regard, at those things that are not meant to be listened to, switches and all these kind of stuff, throw them in a conference room. Of course, you could say now here, oh yeah, he can take the put the stuff in at the back of the phones. Yes, there is always a way, but that is a more or less obvious way than accessing just a switch that stands somewhere around or what else ever. Okay. Operating system 3CX version 20 uses Linux Debian 12 and several Windows versions as operating system. Keep the system secure on an OS level. Regular updates of the OS are required. Linux, the updates are handled via 3CX updates. Windows, handled by the IT partner installer. Generally, automatic Windows updates can be enabled and everything works fine. Last slide. General security thoughts. Firewall, don't go overboard with securing the firewall. Especially don't use stateful deep packet inspection and proxy if SIP is used. If you have to use that, then you have to find a way to keep the SIP traffic out of that area. Yeah. Failover. In case the system needs a high availability, don't only think about 3CX failover, but also internet and power outages and hardware failures as well. Yeah. We all know Murphy's Law. In the worst case, everything goes bad, but just bear in mind there is not only the 3CX system that might fail, but also the internet or the power outage. I mentioned that at the very beginning. Location. If possible, don't install the 3CX if on premise in a spot where strangers can. Turn off general power outlet, unplug the power supply and don't plug it back in. Steal the 3CX hardware or attached devices, switches and so on. Prone to flooding, prone to heat and so on. Yeah, keep that in mind. Of course, it all comes down to the customer. Yeah. Also, these kind of things, they're all always in combination with costs involved. 3CX system. Do not think it's smart to change the database or whatever settings inside the system folders. The system is not meant for this, and you can cause more damage in doing so. Also use cabled network connection only. People who last Tuesday joined the first part of last week's advanced training know what I'm speaking from. Wi-Fi generally is just not considered as a secure connection in terms of stability. SSH, try to keep access from remote on-premise hosted disabled, and if required, try to access from the LAN on-premise or enable specifically open ports on the firewall on hosted deployments when required. Yeah, do not keep SSH open all the time. Okay, go for example on the, let's say on the Azure portal or what else ever, enable SSH access to the phone system and then jump in via SSH. When you're finished, disable it again.